Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to the Bio-Africa Digital Convention of 2021. Our track is on smallholder and food security. And we have a panel of esteemed speakers that are going to share with us their experiences on the topic that we are discussing today. My name is Thulasizwe Mkhabela. I am the Group Executive for Impact and Partnership with the Agricultural Research Council, and I'll be your facilitator for this afternoon. And my job is just to kickstart the session and let it run. Just maybe before I do some opening remarks, the logistics of how this is going to work is I will present in less than, just opening remarks in less than 5 minutes, and then give the floor to the speakers, and each speaker is kindly requested to speak between 8 and 10 minutes, maximum of 10 minutes, so that we can have about 20 to 30 minutes of discussion at the end of the presentation. But within that 8 to 10 minutes, you've got free rein. You can present however you think your topic can best be presented. I think it's a very important topic that we've been given to discuss this afternoon, given that smallholder farmer development is a very important topic in Africa and also in South Africa. Despite South Africa having a well-developed, large-scale commercial farming sector that supplies the bulk of agricultural products, including food and fiber. But that does not take away from the importance of smallholder farmers or small-scale farmers in South Africa, as they are important throughout the continent. And this is more important as we look at the issue of land reform in South Africa and how we actually make sure that the new entrants into the farming sector are actually fast-tracked into the mainstream of agriculture and participate meaningfully, rather than remaining on the peripheries of the sector. And we know that small-scale farmers, and a number of studies and a growing body of evidence has shown that small-scale farmers are and can be more efficient than their large-scale farmers counterparts in terms of how they use the resources that they have at their disposal. And that means that if you take that logic and extend it, is that if they are more efficient, it means they can produce more food per given area of land, which is what we are all looking for in terms of efficiency going forward. And small-scale farmers is a big number of small-scale farmers that cannot just simply be ignored and be left at the margins of the sector, as it were. And these small-scale farmers predominantly find themselves in the rural areas, which makes them very important for the livelihood and the economic viability of rural areas, even in South Africa. And that is why we're here today discussing that. And having said that, the farming sector is faced with a number of challenges. And one of those that come to mind when somebody thinks about challenges is the issue of climate change that is posing a challenge to the farming sector. And the small-scale farmers or smallholder farmers bear the brunt even more than their bigger counterparts because of, in most cases, being resource poor and also having very small profit margins that they cannot afford to actually lose a bulk of their products. So adapting to climate change and ensuring food security requires a dynamic interventions or a dynamic policy environment that will lead to the transformation of the current farming system and food production patterns, as well as food distribution. Because we will know that food security exists when all people in society have adequate food for an active, healthy lifestyle at all times, as the definition goes. And in broad terms, one could look at food security as the availability of safe and nutritious food. Number two, also as the guaranteed capacity to procure and acquire food of good quality and that is produced in a socially acceptable way. These are important definitions or components of what food security entails. And food insecurity, on the other hand, then occurs when the basic healthy food is not easily accessible and poor households struggle to actually access enough food for their nutritious needs. And food insecurity has been identified as a global crisis. That is why we need to discuss the issue of food security, and in this particular case, in line with small-scale or smallholder farmers. With those few words, I would like to actually hand over to our speakers that will be addressing this topic today. And first on the list, we have Dr. Thulasizwe Mkhabela from the National Agricultural Marketing Council, who is a trade specialist in the areas of agricultural exports and imports, frequently publishing an expert analysis on the movement of South African products, trade policies, and new markets. And of late, I know that he's been involved or he has been thrust into the forefront of agricultural policy development in South Africa, with the role that he plays in terms of the development of the agriculture and agro-processing master plan, and even more recently, his involvement in coordinating and facilitating the United Nations Food Security Summit inputs from the South African country perspective. With those few words of introducing him, I would hand over to you, Dr. Thulasizwe Mkhabela, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mkhabela. Thank you very much to the organizers for the convention, for the invitation to us, and good afternoon to my fellow panelists. Let me try and see if I can get my presentation up. Dr. Mkhabela, if you could confirm on your side if my presentation or my slides are available.
I can see your slides. I'm assuming the other participants can.
Thank you very much for that, Doc. Once again, afternoon to everyone on the call, and to also those that are joining us virtually in different parts of our country, as well as beyond the borders of South Africa. What I will try to share with quickly in this topic, which I think is very critical, and you have covered I think you have covered the gist of it, Dr. Mkhabela, in your opening remarks around the challenges, but also around the potential that if we support our smallholder farmers, because of the efficiencies that tends to be associated with them, we could really have a serious impact in terms of our national food, as well as the security of our household in the country, bringing in the stability to the sector. And I think today what I will share in the very two slides is very much informed by some of the key areas which we believe needs to be a center of our attention, both for those that are in the policy making space, but also for those that are in the business, to ensure that we create this inclusive nature of our food system. Very briefly, just so that you know, I work for the National Agricultural Marketing Council, which is an agency reporting and advising the Minister of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, as well as directly affected groups. In essence, what the NAMC stands for is the advisory body, and it has three main regulatory functions into the agricultural sector. The first one is that of advisory services to the minister, as well as to the industry captains. The second one is that of administrative, which really provide the administrative nature around the statutory levies, which are really the instruments that are used by industries to fund their generic services and other areas. And the last one is really the provision and the regulatory of the marketing of agricultural sector since the deregulation around 1996, of ensuring that the sector is run on efficient as well as viable terms. So that's in essence what the organization I work for provides. So the issue of integrating smallholder farmers into formal value chains of the sector forms a center of our functions, but more importantly, ensuring that the food security is entrusted in all the sectors which become part of those. Chair, I think what I wanted to share in very few minutes that I'm left with, so that when we want to unleash the potential of our smallholder farmers, and I will expand that definition to also other non-commercial farmers as well as subsistence farmers, because you could still get smallholder farmers that are operating on commercial basis. So I'm looking at a definition of the smallholder in a sense of the size of the farming operation, but also those that are operating on the non-commercial farmers. I think it is important to first understand the structure that we have as a country today, and understand, because only then we can be able to correctly diagnose the factors that continues to be a barrier for smallholder farmers, but also the factors that continue to lead into this increasing food insecurity in our countries. We know that since the democratic state, as well as the deregulation of our agricultural sector in 1997, poverty as well as food insecurity have increased almost every period whenever they do those food security and food poverty assessment by FSA. And it has gotten worse during the democratic era of our country. And I think because while we say South Africa is a net exporter and a food secured country at the national level, it is very clear when you're looking at a household level that those microeconomic indicators are actually going on the downward side. And key to that is understanding some of those reforms that gave the birth of the sector that we have today. And I think for me, the most important one, which I've put in that blue column in my slide there, is really the understanding of the decision that our policymakers took when they rejoined the WTO and the radical tariff transformation, as well as the removal of all subsidies that were important into the agri sector. Because then what that does is that those that were systematically excluded within the agricultural food system before 1994 were also again systematically excluded beyond that period. The deregulation of the sector, which was very critical because it has really boosted our agricultural economy over the last 2 decades, especially for your fruit industries and other export-oriented industries. But what remains a challenge is the lack of a clear system to integrate our smallholder farmers into the system that we have today. So in essence, without going through the details of all those policies, what we basically find and see is that you still have this two world of food system in the country, the one that is very functional, well-established and operational, and the one that is still remaining very much large and the periphery of our industries. And there's this strong barrier that continues to exist between the two worlds of our farming system. And what we know, as much as every policy document or framework that has come forth in the sector, and if you listen to all the public leaders, as well as the private industry captains, every one of them continues to emphasize the importance of ensuring the two worlds are integrated and the support into the smallholder farmers. But we can clearly say, without necessarily having to be contradicting ourselves, that with an exception of the land reform program, there's really limited support and limited funding and resources that has been catered to ensure that we break this barrier line between what we consider as the emerging and the subsistence and small-scale farming and what we consider as a commercial farming. And that the risk of that in my next slide is basically seen, especially in the two main external shocks that we have seen in the past 18 months. The first with COVID-19, and recently in the last 4 weeks with the unrest that we saw in KwaZulu-Natal and KZN, and why there's a serious need to de-risk our food system, because without necessarily integrating our smallholder farmers, we run a risk of really having an unstable food system going forward. And one of those key things, because of the policies that I've spoken about in my previous slide, is basically what you're seeing now in this slide is basically the same information, but just put in terms of data of how it has shifted over the years. We've seen that through the consolidation process after the deregulation, that large commercial farmers and businesses have gone even bigger because they want to gain economies of scale. And this is not unique to South Africa, it's also following the international trend. But what that does, it says that the emerging and small farmers without a proper support, especially from the public side, stand a very limited chances of surviving in the sector. And translating that into the food security system that we're having in the country is that we continue to see more people unable to afford food on a daily basis. As we know that 1 in every 4 person in South Africa is unable to afford food. But over and above the intake levels, we can see even on critical and essential food that form the food basket of our country, the intake on the average, especially for your lower LSM income group, is very low. If you look, for example, what the UN requires as an ideal intake in the country, if your tomatoes, it's 56% lower than the ideal intake per person on a daily basis. What that means is that even those that can afford and have access to food, the stunting level of our population or our citizen is increasing because of the type of food that we produce, as well as the affordability issues. And one of the key challenges as well as we talk about this food security and these farmers to be integrated into the formal value chain, because Dr. Mkhabela, in your opening remarks, you made it very clear, which I fully agree with that they possess a better chances of creating employment and also of unlocking idle land in the former homelands and those land that is operated by government. and also ensuring that there's rural development. But we continue to see all our agricultural value chain very excluded in nature, where bulk of most of the small-scale farmers and non-commercial operators are really excluded in our programs, as well as in the value chain. They have a limited role that they play. And while we still have very large tract of land that remains potential to be unlocked and incorporated into the sector. So in essence, really, I wanted to just paint a picture of where are the critical policy reforms that perhaps warrant us an opportunity to revisit some of the decisions, because the circumstances as well as the structure in which they were developed under has changed over the last 20 years. And there is a need of basically re-looking at them and align them with the changing global, regional, as well as national policy frameworks, which are really centered now around inclusive growth and inclusivity of even creating employment and unlocking the agriland and designing these programs. And we strongly believe for that to happen and for us to be able to really integrate the small scale farmers while we continue supporting the large and big businesses, there must be a need not only just to promote it on paper, but to actually implement it in our different programs and in our different settings of institution of this private-public partnership. And for that to happen, it starts with recognizing the important and complementary roles of your large farm businesses, which are doing a relatively good job in the country, especially also incorporating latest technologies and improving the resilience of our sector into the climate change and others. But there's also a need to recognize the important role that will be played by small-scale farmers and emerging farmers in improving our food security system at a household level. I think that is very important, because only then when we do recognize their importance, as we have seen during the COVID-19 days, we'll start be able to implement what we've already planned in ensuring that the policies and programs do recognize the two categories of farmers as we want them. And that will happen, as I said earlier, Chairperson, and to our fellow panelists. We really believe that through public-private partnership, including that of academia, will help us to upscale the food system. And the reason for that is because you're then able to avoid this duplication of programs, where you have a program that is running food security that is only supported by the private sector, while government, on the other hand, is doing something totally different, which tend to minimize the impact. And it also increases in terms of spillage and the wastage of our limited resources. But also through private-public partnership, including the academic partnership, it also assists us to work in the coordinated manner, building up and using the different skill set and experiences that is sit in a different part of our agricultural economy, but also relying on latest information, as Dr. Mkhabela, you said in your opening remarks, so that we are able to use the latest research and development, we use the information and be able to even be resilient and mitigate against some of the external shocks, such as that of change in climate, but also these increasing trade distorting diseases that we see continue to be affecting our animal industries. So these are really three areas that I thought I'll share in my opening remarks. Let me take it back to you, Dr. Mkhabela. Thank you for your opportunity and your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ntombela, for your enlightening presentation. I think you've said a lot given the time that you had allocated to you, and we thank you very much for condensing your presentation. And without wasting much time, because I will leave the questions and this discussion for the end when everybody is presented. I would now like to invite Dr. Yolisa Phakela-Jezile, who runs the tropic and subtropical food campus or institute, if you prefer, based of the Agricultural Research Council, based in Nelspruit, in Mbombela, Mpumalanga. But it has a footprint throughout the country where subtropical and tropical fruits can actually grow. Before she took on this role, Dr. Yolisa Phakela-Jezile was in charge of a smallholder agriculture development within the Agricultural Research Council, which I think that is why she finds herself here today, where she actually strongly advocated for the translation of the research work that ARC does into information and training that can be used to build the capacity of smallholder agriculture in South Africa. Even in her new role, she continues to advocate for changes in the agricultural and education sector in the region. Over to you, Dr. Phakela-Jezile.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Dr. Mkhabela, I just want to make sure that my slides are projecting.
Yes, you are. I can see your presentation.
Okay, thank you. So within the broader topic, I decided to just focus on experiences we've had as the ARC on the access to and uptake of agricultural technologies by smallholder farmers. Okay, all right. If you talk of agricultural technologies, there's a wide range of agricultural technologies that have been developing since some scholars say for 10,000 years. I don't know, but if you can see on these diagrams, the earliest technology is just using your hands. And now the latest technology is still using your hands, but everything you're watching on your cell phone. So the main issue about technological advances is to ensure that there's improved yields to feed the growing population, there's efficiencies, and there's profitability. This has been a pursuit throughout time. And the technologies that we are mainly used to, or that are in the mainstream right now, are mainly biotechnology and genetic engineering, mechanization, irrigation, transportation, processing, machinery. But emerging technologies now is something that most of us cannot wrap our heads around. The Internet of Things, robotics, artificial intelligence, remote sensing, cloud computing and blockchain, and renewable energy. Though it's not an emerging technology as such, but there's been a more focus on renewable clean energy for advancement of agriculture, still to improve yields, for efficiencies, and for profitability. Now, in our experiences throughout the years that I've been responsible for smallholder farmer development in the ARC, our main competence there was training and provision of information. And we've tried to provide training services to different sectors of society, from commercial to non-commercial to households. And in a very short space of time, you realize that what you're doing does not produce the desired results. So with time, we've come up with like a checklist of what is needed for our efforts as an organization to be deemed credible and to be tangible, to point at it and to go back after many years to say the ARC has done that. So we realized that you need these 4 boxes mainly. Any farmer or any person needs information to make a decision. And this information has to be credible or from credible sources. And the information comes from all sectors of government, from the private sector, from the markets. So if you do not have this information, to decide what you want to do, your work is still not done. You cannot do anything. So we encouraged people to seek out the information. We encourage these particular organizations to send out the information in any form possible. So that's the part of the program. I mean, that also formed part of the program that I was involved in. And then the training part, and most training that works is practical training and ongoing technical services. You can't just train once and leave it there and expect the person to be, a successful farmer or a processor. And we encourage the farmers to be part of the R&D process, to participate in trials. And the third component was access to markets or linkages to markets. There have been horror stories of people who have planted fields of tomatoes. And when the tomatoes are ripe and red, then they ask, where do we sell this? So, to prevent such tragedies, you have to have your market linkages before you can start your program. And unfortunately, in most cases, most of these smallholder farmers are not linked to any financial institution. They have no credit. So it is important to link smallholder farmers to affordable credit, insurance, some innovative financial services, and so that farmers can invest in their operations and have some savings. And then even if you have all of these four working together, there is still the issues of ownership. There have been many cases where farmers cannot even approach the bank because they have no ownership to their land or to an asset. And this ownership has to be individual because the bank does not lend to groups. And also in cases where our efforts have really worked is when an individual has taken responsibility for what is being done. So group work really is a big problem. And in most programs, people are forced to work together, whether they like it or not. The other part, which I always joke that it needs a psychologist to be part of the team, is the mindset, the willingness for people to change their mindset about the things they used to do and the things that need to be done. There needs to be political will. You will see in one of the examples that in most cases, political interference wreaked havoc in many of these projects. And people must be willing to pay and invest in their operations. And for everything else to work, there needs to be cooperation between government, between the different spheres of government, between government and private sector. Policies need to speak to each other. I understand we do have beautiful policies in South Africa, but at the rate things are going, they're just good on paper. So we need these policies to work together and to be implemented mindfully, not duplicating things, as Sifiso was saying. So if I just make an example of a project that really worked, and I'll show another example of a project that was a total failure. We designed a project with the veterinary services at provinces. The project was simple enough, just connect provincial veterinary services with our Institute for Veterinary Research and provide updates on what is new in that science and plan training programs for animal health technicians at community level. So we had these trainings around the country. And I think on the third one, we realized that we're wasting our time because during that year, there was a high incidence of ticks on animals. And these veterinary workers were saying that the training is good, but really pointless right now because they need a practical solution. They need to address issues of access to medication, issues of infrastructure, to administer the medication. So we quickly had to change our strategy, rework our objective, and assess livestock infrastructure now at communal areas. And at the same time, seek funding for upgrades. Luckily enough, we got some money, about 7 million, if I'm not mistaken. And This was followed by intense community mobilization with a lot of people involved. National departments that I wanted to mention is, besides the Department of Agriculture, there was also Department of Environment and Water, because they needed to do environmental assessment along, where the current dipping tanks were stationed. First of all, these dipping tanks were 40 years old. They were dilapidated. The medicine or effluence was leaking into the rivers, which these tanks were built next to them. So it was a real disaster for everyone. But these stakeholders worked together and reduced our costs, basically, because we did not need to hire any service provider from anywhere. So in each province, the stakeholders worked together. And the best part was that when we're now establishing infrastructure, we hired people from the community. We asked community members to do the work for free, provide the labor for us. And at the end, that brought a sense of ownership for this infrastructure. And people really, took pride when the dipping tanks were finished. Now, at the end of it all, we had 31 animal handling facilities. So a deep tank, an auction facility, and everything else in between. I must admit I'm not an animal scientist, but I had to learn very fast during that year. And the project was implemented successfully, but with the help of everyone involved. So now our training changed, and we had to come up with training programs on production management, animal health, breeding management, including artificial insemination. It was very intense, 3 to 5 years when this project was implemented. But at the end of the day, these communities where the communal dipping facilities were upgraded or rebuilt, the animals increased, the animals looked better, they had auctions, things that they've not had, some of them, for a very long time. And what excited me the most was increase in revenue. People were able to invest, buy more cattle, have better relationship with their neighboring commercial farmers, and they were able to save. Now, this project also had huge challenges, mainly political interference. People always wanted to know, where do we get the money? How can they get the money? And in some cases, lack of cooperation, where the stakeholders did not want to cooperate, especially when there was no money involved. So there was continuous trying to put down fires. And there were few communities that got left behind because of some members not wanting to cooperate at all. And at the end, we had to leave those ones behind, sadly. A very unsuccessful story was the establishment, once again, of seed business in communal areas. This started out very well with our international partners trying to assist us, because South Africa does not have a functional smallholder seed business. So having worked in many African countries, and I've seen how smallholder farmers have seed businesses operating. So I wanted to implement a similar thing here at home. So SEAT, Zimbabwe Super Seed, as well as CIMIT, some of our international partners, Grain SA and Sensaco, some of our private partners, DSI and Department of Agriculture, funded the project. So we also enlisted University of Limpopo and Forte. So we wanted to establish one communal seed nursery, right, for vegetable production and legume production. We chose our site, Timpashe. Markets were identified, they enrolled as well, the local shop, everybody was excited. And we did the same community mobilization throughout. Infrastructure was erected, beautiful nursery, which has a capacity of about 100,000 seedlings. And it operated for about a year. And then within that year, when we're erecting a borehole, there were disputes now on where the borehole was sunk, that the land belonged to somebody else, and he did not want a borehole sunk on his land. So a huge fight started. At the end, we had to move all our operations now to a farm of the ARC, which was not the desired income, but I mean the desired outcome, but to protect the resources, we had to move everything to our site in Nyecha in the Eastern Cape and start all over again. I'm happy to say that that project is going well. We're on our second season of grain seed production. But to empower smallholder farmers in Bashe, it was a total failure, which had nothing to do with the technology, but everything to do with how we could not coordinate our efforts and agree as project stakeholders. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mkhabela Chezile, for sharing your and the ARC's experiences in transferring technology, information, dissemination, and development of smallholder farmers. I would like to then invite Dr. Saskia to come onto the podium. Dr. Saskia has worked in the agricultural development area in many African countries, as well as Asia, Mexico, and Europe. Her current work focuses on highlighting the impact of the climate emergency on the lives of farmers and the environment in which they operate. She is also active in the governance of agriculture in the country. An example of
Sorry, Dr. Mkhabela, we've lost you.
You lost me. Can you hear me now?
Now, yes, thank you.
Did you hear your introduction?
Yes, half of it, but I'm happy to proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. The last part that you might not have heard is that I added that you also continue to play a role in the governance of agriculture in the country through, for example, your involvement by being a member of the Agricultural Research Council. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Mkhabela. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's indeed an honor to be speaking here. And my talk comes after two very good presentations, and one by Dr. Ntombela, looking at the more global aspects that affect smallholder agriculture. And a very, very important point that was mentioned by him was the separation between the two sectors of the agricultural work, that there's very much a commercial sector, and then there's the smallholder farmers, and that the policies that are in place, and especially the financial policies, do not help to integrate these two, with the result that the smallholder farmers are always on the margins. The policies have greatly helped the commercial sector, as he mentioned. But the thing is, how do we support the smallholder farmers? We then had a talk by Dr. Mkhabela Jezile, and I was fascinated by the account that she gave about the case study in the Eastern Cape, because that is very, very, very much the reality. And I'm also interested, because we are not just dealing here with South African, the audience is not just South African, but people from other African countries as well. And in South Africa, of course, because of its history, there is always a lot of agitation around resources, especially when people think there could be an income. And it makes it very, very hard to implement projects, as she was saying. At the same time, what I want to talk about here is the space that is between this global view that was presented by Dr. Mkhabela and this very ground level that was presented by Dr. Mkhabela Jezile. So may I please have the next slide? So this is a very beautiful quotation that I found. And I'm sure that many of you will recognize this type of maize. This is a maize that is ancestral maize, and that's grown by a lot of the older farmers. And I want to this quotation is so beautiful. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist. She's a professor of botany at a American university, but she is also an indigenous American, that's her heritage. So she is very interested in the stories of the ancestors, the memory. And what I want to say, as Dr. Mkhabela emphasized, is that there's a huge psychological aspect to agriculture. And with commercial agriculture, because of all the technology and also the money involved, it is very much a relationship, a commercial relationship. The land is changed. The land has absolutely no spiritual value. The land is dosed with water, chemicals, pesticides, herbicides. Seeds are treated in all sorts of ways. They are altered, their DNA is altered. And then money is tried to be made from this. And the product is not consumed locally. It is exported out of that locality and sold often on foreign markets. So it is a total commercial enterprise. When we look at smallholder agriculture, we hold the memory of the ancestors in those fields. The DNA in every cell carries the story of their fingers poking these seeds into the earth. And then she says, fingers just like mine. She's a professor, just like mine, with dirt under their nails. These farmers nurtured not only food, but extraordinary genetic diversity, with the capacity to adapt to changing climates and an always uncertain future. So with commercial farming, it is, provided one has sufficient funds and investment, it is always easy to change that future. And one can apply technologies to change that. This is not the case for smallholder farmers. So what is important for smallholder farmers is their seeds. Now, as Dr. Mkhabela Jezile mentioned, the South African seed industry for the smallholder farmer is very unlike that in the rest of Africa. It is very problematic. Smallholder farmers cannot get hold of seeds that suit their conditions, not only the conditions of the environment, but also their conditions of the way they manage their crops. I've seen farmers who I can say are farming stones. They've got land that is so stony. You just wonder how they even get any crops out of there. How is that possible that farmers have no access to suitable land when all they want to do is feed their families? So let us just remember this. I also want to say a very touching thing, that whenever I speak to older farmers and I show them these maize cobs, they go into a kind of a trance. Yeah, I remember this from my parents or from my grandparents. And you can just see the mind going back to that period when agriculture was different, when there was no climate change, when there was enough rain, and there was especially enough food. Now, Dr. Mkhabela mentioned that since the democratic dispensation in South Africa, that food insecurity has actually increased. So that really is a strong pointer to the fact that the policies are not what they should be. Please may I have the next slide? Okay, so here I've got a quick synopsis of, because I want to really focus, I was going to talk more about women, but then I thought, let me also focus on the youth, because in South Africa, we have a program for emergent farmers, and the Minister of Agriculture has been making many statements about making land available for women farmers, but we have a 420 million youths in Africa, the majority of whom do not have stable economic opportunities. So this is the next generation. Those who are not students, 1/3 are unemployed. And where do you get food if you're unemployed? 1/3 are vulnerably employed. And then the other third is in wage employment, but often with no contract. So in very difficult situations, those jobs can be cancelled at any day. So vulnerably employed would be people who are helpers, maybe agricultural laborers. And then we, of course, have those who are not employed at all. What kind of message is this giving about the value we place on human life in Africa? Then the other shocking thing is that Africa has the world's youngest population. So 60% of that population is under 35 years old. These are all people who have a dream. They want to have children. They want to send their children to school. They themselves want to have a life of at least enough. And the word enough is a lovely word. I'm putting that in quotation marks. Enough, and that means enough to buy a few clothes and enough to eat and for the family to eat. We're not even talking about all those who have dreams about Mercedes-Benzes. So can we please go to the next slide? Maybe some of you are familiar with this particular clip that went viral. And this is a young medical doctor from, and very interestingly, she is from Zambia, and I will tell you why that's interesting. And she was giving a talk, and she's holding a brochure there that was produced by an agency, a donor aid agency, with an older woman and very traditional woman. And this young woman is saying, and her name is Happy Face, which I thought was a lovely name. She was saying, make agriculture sexy. As you will see there, that's my title for this slide. Make agriculture sexy so that the youth will not just dream about leaving those terrible conditions back home, but that they will actually want to be there. So now I'm going to say, how do we make agriculture sexy? But before we go to the next slide, I want to just say something very interesting. I was discussing this particular young woman with some of my colleagues at the ARC. And I was then told by Dr. Mishek Mulumba that this thing, why she was saying, make agriculture sexy, because she emphasized that despite being a medical doctor, that she is actually a farmer and she wants to be known as a farmer. That way back, President Kenneth Kaunda emphasized everybody must grow food. And that is so part of the Zambian culture. Everybody must grow food. You are not a human if you are not growing your food. And what is so interesting, that is taking us back maybe 60 years. That maxim is still with the culture of the people. Everybody must grow food. And she was promoting that, keeping our young people out of the hospitals, but on the farms. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so here, a little bit more of a shocking statistic is that the average age of farmers in Africa is 60 years. So how can a continent feed itself? As I just mentioned in the previous slide, 60% of the population is under the age of 35. And yet our farmers are around 60 years old. So there's a perception amongst the youth, and I think this is right across Africa, that farming is an unattractive career path. It's for poor people. It's something that you do when you have no other options. It's characterized by hard labor, long hours, very poor remuneration, and you have no social recognition. It's for losers. So how do we then promote farming when the general social recognition of it is that it's for losers? It's those who couldn't make it anywhere else. So then some of the main obstacles to young people are lack of access to suitable land, as I explained earlier, finance, and that again takes us back to the statement made by Dr. Mkhabela about lack of suitable finance. Then markets, as Dr. Phakela mentioned, and then the actual practical skills that are barriers to youth participation. Part of these practical skills is also how to work as a team, how to work as a group. As she mentioned, there were terrible fights. You get it and I don't get it, so let's fight. But at the same time, when finance is being made available, it's available for individuals. It's not available to groups. How is that possible? Because in Africa, farmers work in groups. Okay, next slide, please. Right, now we are dealing with climate change. Here we see two very, very emaciated cattle. This is actually a picture from the Northern Cape. And I don't know if any of you can see any food for these poor cattle to eat, but I'm just seeing a few spiny aloes. And you know, that is really very much the status quo. Climate change is increasing. That means that the risk for farmers, such as hail, droughts, floods, and cold weather, will increase. I've seen photos from the farmers groups that I'm on of whole farms that were people that were working in town, and when they got their retirement package, they bought smallholder farms. They bought them themselves. They weren't given that land. They bought them. They invested their money in that. And then you get hail and winds and cold weather, and the whole farm is destroyed. Where do those people go? What do they do? So to end off, and I have lots more to say, but I'm very cognizant that my time is very short. So I just want to say that the ARC has developed excellent weather and rain forecasting tools as parts of its fourth Industrial Revolution initiatives. Dr. Phakela did mention a little bit there. She could not really go in detail. So could we please have the next slide? Now, that brings us to the other very important issue, and that is energy. Countries in Africa at the moment are very low in their carbon footprint, but if they want to develop, they need to build their energy storage capacity and their energy generation capacity. So they need to get gains in energy efficiency. But how do they do that when the infrastructure isn't there? And infrastructure is simple things like the roads, because you need to move. People need to move around that. How do you deal with climate change if you cannot deal with your energy requirements? And that is energy for agriculture as well as for residential and commercial sectors. And it says they demand from industrial, and we will put agriculture in that because agriculture is an industry. So can we have the next slide, please? So as I said at the beginning, I wanted to really focus on youths, and I did mention a little bit about the fourth industrial revolution. So many youths in Africa have digital have received some digital training, but we really need to amp that up so that agricultural skills can be, the training for agricultural skills can also have a strong emphasis on technological farming, especially in cities. The youth really need to go there. There's money to be made in farming in the cities. Then the policy environment that we were talking about earlier needs to be orientated to the needs of women and youths regarding access to not just land, but suitable land. Suitable land has water sources, has decent soil, has some sort of wind protection. There is no point giving people a piece of land that consists of stones. And then lastly, we need weather-based insurance policies. I know that the insurance sector has made proposals and proposed policies to government in 2019, and we have not had any movement on that. So how is that possible as climate change is increasing? This has not been dealt with. So I will end there. I'm sure I've gone over my 10 minutes, but I just wanted to give an overview of the serious key issues where we really need to have a strong input from government and different sectors working together. And I want to emphasize commercial farmers have to step into the boots and help with funding, with training and technologies. Thank you very much, Dr. Mkhabela. I will end there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saskia. Without wasting much time, because we don't really have a lot left, Tabi, may I not introduce you extensively? Suffice to say that you are an agricultural economist, investor, and agribusiness strategist, and Tabi holds an MBA and a postgraduate diploma from the Gordon Institute of Business Science and a Bachelor of Science Agricultural Economics degree from University of Pretoria. Over to you, because our time is really running out. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mkhabela, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to try and make this quick. My topic for today is sustainable food supply chains and how it is that smallholder farmers can increase their participation in such supply chains. I was quite encouraged, I must say, by this topic because in understanding the interventions required to increase smallholder farmer participation in supply chains, we need to understand the different complexities and where the various pain points are for various smallholder farmers. So I'll really be tackling this discussion in 3 points. Firstly, looking at what it is that the food supply chain entails and the various iterations thereof. Secondly, looking at the current challenges within the food supply chains and how they really threaten sustainability over the long term. And then thirdly, really trying to get to a broader definition of sustainability, particularly when we look at the literature, looking at how we expand our concept of sustainability and looking at some new and emerging themes around sustainability that to a large extent support the participation of smallholder farmers. So on this slide, I've just provided a very simplified typical food supply chain, looking at the various points that produce goes through from farmer to consumer, and really looking at the various complexities within this. As you can see, there's quite a different, in any given commodity or in any given good, produce has to travel through quite a number of different points. And with the rise of global value chains, we even find greater complexity in this, where various points of the supply chains can happen in a number of different geographies, which increases the complexity. What further complicates this issue is that there tends to be quite a lot of political soft points, but also social soft points that I find that we don't normally tackle when we talk about the food supply chains and purely look at it from commercial or economic points of view, which then really, I think, makes us miss a lot of opportunities for intervention. If we look at where the various challenges are in the supply chain, we have to acknowledge that there have been a number of achievements over the past decades, largely because of the industrialization and mechanization and standardization of the supply chain. We've been able to feed an ever-growing population. We've been able to meet demand in different geographies. And that's, of course, a huge achievement for the food value chain in general. But of course, as time has gone on, we've seen a number of different challenges that really give us a picture of what we can expect in 20 years' time, 30 years' time, and that really tell us that this supply chain as we have it currently is not sustainable. So really some of the challenges are on this slide. The first is that it tends to be quite fragile. And we've seen with the recent COVID-19 pandemic, when a number of points were closed around the world and how that trickled through the supply chain, affected food supply across the world. And of course, that really speaks to the fragility of the supply chain in its current form. Secondly, a lot has been written about the negative externalities of the food supply chain in its current form, talking to issues of a loss of biodiversity, monocropping, environmental impact, and the carbon emissions that the food supply chain generally contributes to around the world. Another big issue that is receiving increasing attention is this issue of food loss and food waste. When we talk about how we're going to feed the growing population, we often focus on how we increase production. But of course, we have to acknowledge that, we're talking about increasing production in the midst of all this food shortage, post-harvest losses. And of course, then that talks to efficiency and effectiveness within the supply chain, that something is going missing. And then an issue that we've spoken about quite a bit, particularly in this discussion, is this issue of exclusion, particularly for smallholder farmers, where the barriers to entry into formal supply chains tend to be quite high. They focus on large scale economies and of course, cold storage chains that a lot of smallholder farmers are unable to access. And of course, this leads to inequality, which can have immense socioeconomic challenges as well. And then, trust deficiencies. With a longer supply chain, you have food traveling through so many intermediaries that the consumer starts to lose trust within the supply chain. When you look at things like olive oil or honey with, issues of adulteration in areas of the supply chain. So consumers are starting to demand a lot of transparency around this. And then, of course, as we've spoken to, Dr. Ntombela pointed to this as well, the slow pace of innovation when it comes to looking at funding models, looking at distribution models to incorporate a greater diversity of suppliers within the supply chain. So it then stands to reason that we need to have a much broader definition of sustainability when we look at the food supply chain, far beyond just looking at the environment, which is normally what we talk about when we talk about sustainability. So in terms of sustainability, we're looking at a number of different factors. A sustainable supply chain needs to not only be environmentally conscious, but it also needs to be quite resilient, not just to climatic shocks, but to other macroeconomic shocks. We're talking about a system that minimizes food loss and food waste. We're talking about a system that is inclusive and diverse, that really incorporates a number of different size farmers, a number of different participants in there, rather than the kind of homogenous sector that we have currently. And then, of course, it's a system that effectively meets the needs of consumers that are constantly changing over time. And this supply chain needs to adapt as those needs change as well. Encouragingly, there's been a recognition about this broader definition of sustainability in the supply chain. And we've seen a lot of emergent themes, largely directed by the European Union and the Food and Agriculture Organization, that looks at how we can increase sustainability in the food supply chain. And the first of those is this concept of circular food economy that looks at how we get continuous feedback across the supply chain, where members of the supply chain are increasingly accountable to one another. And we increase the linearity of supply and consumption, where the farmer supplies, the consumer consumes and throws away. So this really talks about how we start to really reuse, looking at what we produce and how we produce it as well. The second issue that's receiving greater attention, both locally and globally, is the concept of short food supply chains. And this really talks about how it is that we can reduce the number of intermediaries in the supply chain. And so we've seen a number of different and interesting models locally where we're looking at how it is that we can directly link the farmer to the consumer. We've seen virtual trading platforms where farmers can market to retailers directly. And this, of course, cuts out the middleman and gives the farmer a greater bargaining power when it comes to various off-takers. Thirdly, we're looking at the role of public policy in increasing farmer inclusion, because the supply chain in its current form didn't happen by mistake. It was the deliberate action of policymakers and private sector participants that have led to the supply chain being the way that it is. And we're seeing a greater level of discussion around what the role of public policy needs to be in increasing smallholder inclusion. And increasingly, we've been hearing things about public procurement, where the government is putting in place programs to start procuring from smallholder farmers for things like hospitals, prisons, etc. And we really hope to see some action around that. And of course, some research and support is needed around how it is that we can start to get smallholder farmers to produce differentiated products that allow them to not just try and force themselves into established supply chain, but recreate an entirely different route to market for different products that are gaining momentum in the domestic economy. Fourthly, we're looking at innovative finance and the aggregation of smallholder farmers. So, essentially, when we speak to different off-takers and manufacturers, they will talk about the high transaction costs of dealing with smallholder farmers. And we've seen some interesting models around how we can start to aggregate the produce of smallholder farmers so that they can collectively bargain with larger off-takers. We've seen some innovative solutions around supply chain finance that not only focuses on the traditional funding mechanisms, but also allows some flexibility in terms of collateral that particularly suits smallholder farmers. And so with these kind of things, I think, we're moving to a level of sustainability in the supply chain, but very deliberate actions need to be taken, not just by researchers, but by government and also the participants in the supply chains themselves. Dr. Mkhabela, that's my story. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nkosi, for your interesting presentation. Colleagues, I'm afraid that we're not going to have time for questions and answers because our time has really run out on us. I've encouraged colleagues to put in their comments and questions on the chat box. Then we'll try and respond to them because we have contacts of everybody who attended this session. And the organizers are telling me that we need to move on. The session should have ended by now. So in order to encourage a discussion beyond this forum, please drop in your comments on the chat box. We will then look at everybody who participated and facilitate a discussion going further so that we can take these issues further. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you very much for your presentations, and thank you very much for being so attentive for the participants that were waiting to ask questions, and I apologize for that. Thank you.